this morning. Or I would have run out of time this morning. Run out of time. See, I do think about time. It is there, deep in the back of my mind. Okay, let's sing 11 and 12. Okay, so Sunday nights we're just kind of going through the songbook. We already know these, but we'll sing them. So 11 and 12. Just stay seated, enjoy the song, and then we'll stand and sing one more in a minute. So 11 and 12. So I sing the mighty power of God. This is an old song from the 1700s. So let's sing it together. Here we go. I sing the mighty power of God that made the mountains rise, that spread the flowing seas abroad and built the lofty skies. I sing the wisdom that ordained the sun to rule the day. The moon shines full at his command, and all the stars obey. I sing the goodness of the Lord that filled the earth with food. He formed the creatures with his word and then pronounced them good. Lord, how thy wonders are displayed where'er I turn my eye. If I survey the ground I tread or gaze upon the sky, there's not a plant or flower below but makes thy glories known. And clouds arise and tempests blow by order from thy throne, while all that borrows life from thee is ever in thy care. Everywhere that man can be, thou God art present there. Tonight, this is working just fine. And now this is not working. Isn't that great? Number 12, right across the page. Great and mighty. I think Simon fixed it. Good job, Simon. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. From the 1700s to 1986. Here we go. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Lift his banner, let the anthem ring. Praises to our mighty King. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Sing to Jesus with a song of praise. Sing to Jesus with praise. Sing to Jesus with a song of praise. Sing to Jesus with praise. Fill the heavens with a mighty voice. Bless his name, let all rejoice. Sing to Jesus with a song of praise. Sing to Jesus with praise. All right, and one more, all the way to the back, 619. We were going to sing this morning, and I forgot to get it. I forgot to communicate with piano player, and we ended up needing the time anyway. Why don't we stand and sing this one? Goes right with the message this morning. You don't have to stand. You're welcome. 619, we'll understand it better by and by, right out of our text this morning. We are often tossed and driven on the restless sea of time. Somber skies and howling tempests oft succeed the bright sunshine. In that land of perfect day, when the mists have rolled away, we will understand it better by and by. By and by, when the morning comes, when the saints of God are gathered home, we will tell the story, how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by. We are often destitute of the things that life demands. Want of food and want of shelter, thirsty hills and barren lands. We are trusting in the Lord, and according to his word, we will understand it better by and by. By by. Trials dark on every hand, and we cannot understand all the ways that God would lead us to that blessed promised land. But He guides us with His eye, and we'll follow till we die, and we'll understand it better by and by. By and by, when the morning comes, all the saints of God are gathered home. We will tell the story, how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by. This is the fourth verse, but it's not in our songbook, so we'll just stop right there. All right, you may be seated. Great singing this morning. It's morning somewhere. Oh, by and by. We'll get it. All right, let's get our Bibles. Jack, why don't you help us out with handouts? If you didn't get one on your way in, Jack has a handout. What now? The head usher has given us his instructions, and raise your hand if you need one. He will bring you a handout as we get to 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10. And I'm just amazed at how, and maybe it's just in my head, that could be, there's a lot of weird things there, but this just goes real well with Romans chapter 8, so about working through different things. And so let's look at that, and there's some kind of fill in the blanks things, some things for you to look at. I'm really trying to keep these messages just straight through, some application, and we'll take time to pray together. That's important. We're going to kind of recap a couple of prayer requests and break up and take a few minutes to pray here at the end. We've got an update from a missionary that we don't support but came through several years ago. Just saw it, I think, yesterday or this morning, and we're going to pray for them. And so let's look at 1 Kings chapter 10. Now, just like we did last time, I'm going to read it as we go because it's not very long, but I think it'll just help us with time to work through it. And so just as an overview, this is, we're looking at Solomon. We kind of changed the subtitle. Oh, here we go. About Solomon's legacy. So Solomon has finished the temple, and so now we're going to look at what do we remember about Solomon? What is his legacy? And then we'll end Solomon's life next week in chapter 11. And so far, we can see a lot of the problems. We know where it ends. We know where Solomon ends, turning from God, and his heart was turned. And we don't really see any of that mentioned in the text until we get there. We see it coming, but we don't see it mentioned in the text, and you'll notice that as we read this. So we're going to look at the spectacular possibilities of spectacles. So what is a spectacle? Do you kids know what spectacles are? What are spectacles? People what?
I don't know.
So they used to call glasses spectacles, and I think we should start doing that again. Say, I need my spectacles, But that's not what we're talking about. A spectacle, when we use the word spectacle, it's kind of like talking about something that's obnoxious. We've sort of used the word obnoxious in our house lately. And on your handout, I found a picture of a woman in a hat. And my mom said, this is not Kamala Harris. That's not who this is. But it's a woman in a hat. And it's kind of a spectacle. Okay, it's kind of like, wow, that is ridiculous. Now, some ladies wear big hats, and that's probably fine. This would be a little bit over the top, okay, bring that in. And so a spectacle is something that you just sort of see it, and it's kind of like, oh, wow, you are a spectacle. Now, one of the things, and Brother Justin can probably appreciate this too, but I'm very aware as we are raising kids and homeschooling our kids, I'm very aware of the possibility of our kids looking like homeschooled kids. You know what I mean? You go to places and you're like, in fact, that's a saying around our house. You cannot leave the house that way. You look like a homeschool kid. And that's terrible because we like that. But there's a certain thing, your pants are a little bit too high. You've got a belt with your sweatpants with several knives and a microscope hanging from it and things like that. I wasn't talking about you. I'm just saying anybody could do it. And it just happens when kids don't hang around other kids. And the other kids are like, hey, you probably shouldn't do that. Now, I was I have forgotten most of that stage of my life, and so I don't even want to know how that was. And kids get a lot of other things from hanging around other kids, mostly bad, and so it's kind of a good trade-off. But anyway, some people may do things. Some people may, I don't know, color their hair or wear loud socks. I've got some loud socks on today, or have their Bible rebound with weird, colorful end paper. You know, some people do weird things, and maybe a little bit of that's okay. But sometimes people want to be a spectacle, and they do things that get attention. We're kind of in political season, and sometimes you'll see signs and things that are intended to get attention, to make you think about a certain candidate. You know, I mean, Trump stuff is like, red hats and big flags. Those are all intentional, and they do their job of directing your attention to whatever candidate. Now, some people become a spectacle accidentally. Maybe they do well in something, and they're really good, and they just sort of, people know them as that thing. Or maybe they're really bad at something, and they become a spectacle. And whether we like it or not, sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we're getting attention, or maybe had an extra blessing. It could be wealth-related. It could even be a trial that someone goes through, a medical condition that can bring attention or give someone that extra attention. And so Solomon, as we read through this text, he is a spectacle. He's one of the biggest spectacles in history as far as wealth goes. It's over the top. It really, I know I'm thinking of Trump all physical, just gold-plated everything, but that's sort of where Solomon was at this point, and that's what chapter 10 deals with. Now, the theme of this chapter is clearly the wealth of Solomon. That's what we see, and it's really a list of a lot of those things. But we know that all Scripture it's profitable. It's there for our teaching, for our rebuke, for our encouragement, for how to grow as a Christian. So it's here for us. So we're going to get to the teaching part at the end. But let's look at what the narrator tells us about Solomon's wealth. And this is kind of the question that this text will answer. Solomon gets so wealthy. Why so much wealth? And I think this text shows us at least one of the answers to it. And then there's kind of an implied warning there as well that we will look at. So the first thing, did you get it there? Oh, it's in your hand? You don't? Yeah. You're just copying it out to be overachiever. That's good. No, that's fine. You can write it. You can write my notes twice. You'll become my favorite child. Okay, so Solomon's spectacular wealth. So Solomon spent how long on the temple? Not 14. Less than that.
10.
Less than that.
5.
7 years. 10 points for the girl. You didn't even know. You just said a number. Okay, wow. 7 years on the temple, and then 13 years on his own palace. That's more of a campus, lots of buildings, a lot of time. And then there's ongoing construction that we saw last week. And so let's kind of walk through. This is verses 14 through 29. So Simon, if you can keep up with me, we're going to start with 14. I'm just going to read it. This is pretty much the last half of the chapter. And I'll read it, and then we'll kind of go through things very quickly. We're going to do this very quickly, I hope. So we see that the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year, right? That's I'm in chapter 9. No wonder that doesn't make sense. Like, that's totally different than my Bible. Okay. The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. That's 25 tons of gold. That's all. I mean, when you're weighing gold, we normally weigh gold by the ounce, and you may even get a partial ounce, and it's worth a lot. These are weighed in tons. Just wrap your mind around that. I didn't calculate out how much that's worth, but that's a lot. More than I have. So he has 25 tons of gold every year. Beside that he had of the merchantmen and of the traffic of the spice merchants and of all the kings of Arabia and of the governors of the country. So he's got a lot of income. Verse 16, and Solomon made 200 targets of beaten gold. These are like large shields. And it says 600 shekels of gold, which is about 15 pounds of gold, in one target. Okay, so he has 200 of those. And he made 300, so fewer of them, 300 shields. These are smaller shields of beaten gold. It says 3 pounds of gold. In our pounds, it's about 4 pounds of gold, went to one shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. That's one of the buildings that he built. Moreover, the king made his throne. So here's what his throne looks like. It's made out of ivory. It's overlaid with the best gold. Has 6 steps. On the top of the throne was round behind and stays on either side of the seat. 2 lions beside the stays. And then there's 12 lions. And so basically there's 6 steps. And there's a lion on each side all the way down. It says there's none like it in any kingdom. Verse 21, and all King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. There were no silver. It was not even accounted for in the days of Solomon. You get out the fine silver. He didn't have to shine the silver. That was wasteful. It's just gold. Everything's gold. Verse 22, the king had a navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram. 1 in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish to bring gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. He imported apes. So why did he do that? Because he could. I don't know why else. They probably hadn't seen many apes in Israel, but now here's some apes, and peacocks. Okay, peacocks are kind of loud and obnoxious, but it was a spectacle, and that's what he did. Okay, so keep going. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and wisdom. And all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And they bought every man his present, vessels of silver and gold and garments and armor and spices and horses and mules at a rate year by year. So there's kind of a tribute. They all want to deal to make a treaty, an arrangement. What's the word I'm looking for? Alliance. Thank you. That's the word I'm thinking of. They all wanted an alliance with Solomon. Verse 26. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen whom he bestowed in the cities for chariots with the king at Jerusalem. And once again, we're reminded he made silver to be in Jerusalem like stones. It was just like rocks. And cedars were like sycamore trees that are in the vale or the valley for abundance. And Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt and linen yarn, and the king's merchants received the linen yarn at a price. And we'll talk about that verse in a minute. And a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver. That's about 15 pounds of silver. And a horse for about 150, about 4 pounds of silver. So all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria, they did bring them out by their means. Okay, so there's a lot going on. Solomon's wealth is spectacular. If you could just tour Jerusalem at the time, you would see a completely different world than what Saul and David and really the kings after them. It would be a whole different world. Just a very rapid fire. There's a lot of notes here, but I'm just going to go really fast. This chapter covers a lot of these, but not all of them. But just to put it all together to help wrap our mind around it, we don't have a picture. I think there's a picture of the throne room on there that someone went back in time and took. But most of this we just have to come up with on our own. So you have the house of the forest of Lebanon, which we were introduced to a few chapters earlier. And this was sort of like a reception hall, but it was massive. They called it the house of the forest of Lebanon because they used whole cedar trees as the columns to set up this massive, almost a receiving area where dignitaries would come through. It would sort of lead up to the throne area. And now we see that he wasn't just taking these cedar trees, which when you think, well, what's the big deal about a cedar tree? It would be like having a cedar tree columned place in Wellington. Because if you look around, we don't have a lot of cedar trees. We have mesquite trees, which are beautiful and frustrating, and I have markings from going out and looking for cows, and cedar trees get you up, and I don't want to put those anywhere that I like. I want to burn them all to the ground, right? Those mesquite trees are awful. But around here, if you were to all of a sudden have sequoia trees, right, something that you'd have to import, right, it'd be about the same idea. Massive column, whole timbers in a place, you'd be like, wow, what is that person trying to do? Well, that's the idea. It would be huge. And if that wasn't enough, he's now decorated them with these solid gold shields everywhere. So it's really a sign of, it's a flex. When foreign powers would come in, they could gather and they could see this as they visited Solomon. You have the Justice Hall, which was Solomon's, that famous lion throne. And that's kind of what there's a artist rendition of that on the other side of your handout there, but just this massive, intimidating throne that was there. So that's just the palace campus. But then there's these other projects, any one of which would be a feat, an accomplishment for any king of Israel. You have these fortresses and treasure cities, which we saw in chapter 9 last week, all over the country. They set up military outposts and treasure cities, and the way it mentions it, sometimes it's just things that would delight Solomon, things that he wanted. Why did you build that city, Solomon? Because I wanted to, because he could. And so he did. Summer palaces, the delights of Solomon, that's what I was getting at. One all the way up in Lebanon, just places where the king of Israel could go. It just shows the breadth of his power, that he wasn't just stuck in his little tribe, which is what Canaanite tribal lords or whatever, those the people that used to run Canaan. It's sort of the difference, I would say. I could imagine the difference between like Indian tribes in America back in the day versus like kings of Europe that would have widespread authority, right? It used to be, so Palestine was more of a tribal area where they just sort of had their small collections of groups. You look at all these kings, but most of them are just over small groups of people. Solomon, not anymore. Now there's a king in Palestine that has summer houses all over the world. It's just a sign of strength. And so that's what, those are just his additional projects. Now, commerce totally changed in Solomon's day. We have land traffic going all over the place. We mentioned, the text mentioned stuff from Arabia, which would have had to be brought over through long international highways. Israel is now trading in, in spices, frankincense, myrrh, all kinds of things like that. They're trading things. They're trading horses. We'll get to that in a minute. The land traffic is crazy. Sea traffic has become a thing. We looked a little bit at this last week, but now he talks about how he has worked with Hiram, who he got the cedars from, to develop a navy, and they went to Tarshish. They had regular routes to Tarshish, which Tarshish is on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar in Spain. That's where Jonah ran to, remember? As far as they could go. He goes all the way that far. Israel is now importing stuff from there. These are the people that, if they wanted a crazy exotic time, they'd go to Egypt, and that wasn't that far. When we're thinking of Egypt and Israel thinking, wow, it took them 40 years to get there. Well, they did donuts for 40 years. You could just make the trip, right? You could just go over there. Now they have people importing stuff from all over the place. So it wasn't just like little markets in Israel. It's like World Market. It's like going to World Market. We're like, here's stuff from all over the world that's here now. So it's crazy, all the stuff that they're doing. And the advances in technology, Scripture doesn't give us a lot on this, but there's other sources that talk about Solomon's fountains that are referenced in other things where he brought in water from other parts of the country to supply Jerusalem with water. It's a high-tech thing to do. The Navy, we talked about that. At this point forward in Jewish literature, you'll find references to the sea and different things that Israel had really their only sea was crossing the Red Sea, and they didn't need a boat for that one. They just sort of went right over, But now there's voyages and there's things like that happen. The presidential motorcade was changed. What did, this is a good Bible trivia question, what did David ride on? Remember? A horse? His feet? You were closer with horse.
A carriage.
Not a carriage.
Dragon?
Here's a reminder. Absalom stole his and rode on it. A mule. Did you come up with that? No. Who told you? Grandma told you. 10 points taken away from the girls. Anyway, no. So the king would ride on a mule. It's a nice mule, right? But now Solomon is riding around. When you read the Song of Solomon, you read a little bit of connection to this. It's like a carried, like you read like Aladdin or something, like in this big thing that they would carry around, and you'd have attendants and a whole motorcade worth, which is what the kings of other nations did. It was another flex. But the king of Israel never had that option, but now he does. So there's a lot of stuff going on. The military technology booms, and that's what this last paragraph I said we'd come back to. So he's now controlling. The king of Israel is controlling the sale of war machines, is what this means. It tells us in verse 21 that he brings out horses out of Egypt and linen yarn. Now, this is one place where the word linen yarn is a word Q, Q-U-E, and that means linen yarn. But Q is also the name of a place. So, which makes sense when you're reading through this and you're like, we're talking about horses, and then all of a sudden we're talking about yarn. What does that mean? Well, Q it's been discovered after the fact that it's a nickname for Cilicia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And so what this text is probably telling us is that Solomon brought horses out of Egypt and Turkey, which is from the south and the north, which actually Turkey is an appropriate word, because if I were to say I got horses from Egypt and Turkey, you'd have to depend on the context to say, well, did you go to Egypt and get horses in Turkey? It's like, no, I went to Turkey, the country of Turkey, and there's the country of Q or Cilicia. It refers to linen yarn, but it probably is saying that Solomon imported horses and chariots not just from Egypt in the south, but far north from Turkey. And then it talks about he is controlling the prices of them. So we have gone from there was a time when Israel didn't even have chariots, when they didn't even have war machines. And now not only do they have war machines, but all the war machines in the region have Solomon's name on them because he is controlling the sale of it. That's a huge thing. He doesn't just have arms, he's an arms dealer. And so it's a huge position of power. And if he's the arms dealer, you're probably not going to fight against him, right? It's just another power move that Solomon is doing. And so what we can come up with, and I'm sorry, this was a cheap shot, but Israel was great again, okay? So it was. Israel had become a fantastic force. In fact, again, may not even be right, because this was like the first time that Israel was this great. This would be what future kings would look back to and say, oh man, the kingdom of Solomon, that was the day when everything was like it should be, and it was an amazing thing. And just as a commentary, the narrator of our text gives us just a couple of times he mentions that silver was nothing. Silver was nothing. They counted the gold, and silver was it's almost like saying people didn't even care about the $20 bills. They just had the $100 bills. If you found a 20 on the street, you wouldn't even pick it up. I would, but everybody else. It's that kind of a thing. It's like, you've got to be kidding. It was just an amazing thing. So that's the background. That's the facts. That's what Israel was like when you lived in Israel during that time. The text does not tell us that any of these things are good or bad. You may read this and say, should the king of Israel really be the chariot monger? No, he should not, and that's going to come up later. But it's just here to show us, here's what it was. It was definitely a spectacle. But if you want to learn something, one of the things you can do is look at the facts. You can say, what was it actually like? And this is the closest we can get to getting pictures of what it was like in Israel during that time. But if you want to know more, for example, if you're visiting a place you've never been before, and you want to find a restaurant to eat at, you might use Yelp, which, the internet's a curse in many ways, but in many ways it's a blessing, because you can use Yelp, and we use it all the time if you're going to go somewhere and say, what's a good restaurant? And you could find Yelp, and you can say, here's a Mexican restaurant I want to try out, and you can say, you can see a picture of it, you can see a menu, you can see what the people that own the restaurant say about it, and that's all fine, but is that all you need to know about the restaurant? Probably not. So Yelp will give you more information. It'll give you more details. Yelp will show you how many health code violations that place has, which with a Mexican restaurant, you want some. You know what I'm saying? If it's a good Mexican restaurant, there's going to be some health code violations, but not a lot. You want them to kind of be on the edge, but not a lot. Some of you are like, that's horrible. Well, it's true, and so that's what you look for. But the other thing, the big thing that Yelp gives us is what? What do those things do to help us know if we should go to a place or not? The reviews. You want to get independent reviews from people that have been there, because an unbiased review can tell you way more than the menu, especially if the person doing the review actually knows what they're talking about. And you kind of have to read them to find that out. And so the Queen of Sheba shows up in chapter 10. That's at the first part of the chapter. We skipped it earlier because I want to get to that. That's kind of what this chapter focuses on. And so we see all these things going on. Now, when it comes to kingdoms, she is a legitimate reviewer. She is a queen. So Sheba is, of all the pictures I put on this thing, I forgot to put a map, but it's way down at the southern end of where Saudi Arabia would be. Your Bible may have maps somewhere, but it's way down in the southern tip. In order to go, if you were to go from like the Indian Ocean up through the Red Sea to get to as close as you can to Israel, you'd have to go right by Sheba. So she's in a place, and the country Sheba. Her name isn't Sheba. It's not Queen Sheba. It's Queen of Sheba. But anyway, so she gives this interesting review. Let's read it. This is verses 1 through 13. So I'm going to read it, and Simon, you can take over here for me. So it says, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon coming concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train. A train, Clive. She had a train. Isn't that cool? It wasn't Thomas, though. It was just a train of camels and spices. So, sorry about that. And very much gold. and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all questions, or he answered all of her questions. And there was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all of Solomon's wisdom in the house that he had built, and the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, the attendance of his ministers, their apparel, his cupbearers, the ascent by which he went to the house of the Lord. It says there is no spirit in her. Spirit's the same Hebrew word for breath. So we might say it took her breath away. That's what happened. She's like, I don't even know what to do. Now look at her review. It's verses 6 through 9. And she said to the king, it was a true report that I heard in my own land of thy acts and thy wisdom. Howbeit I didn't even believe it until I came and my eyes had seen it, and behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I had heard. Happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, and that hear thy wisdom. And look at this. Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighted in thee to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. That's why he made thee king, to do judgment and justice. And she gave him 120 talents of gold, just 4.5 tons. She wrote a check for 4.5 tons of gold. And spices, very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And the navy also of Hiram brought gold from Ophir. They brought in Ophir from Ophir, plenty of almug trees and precious stones, and the king made the almug trees pillars of the house. It just is sticking in more stuff that he did. It was the greatest almug trees ever, the best in the world. That's what they were. Verse 13, King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all her desire, whatever she asked. Beside that, Solomon gave her of his royal bounty, so she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. So she comes, she brings a camel train of treasures, probably some interesting things to wow Solomon with stuff that he'd never seen before. I'm sure that's her intent. I'm going to give him I'm going to show him some spices he's never seen before, except he has, because he already has a navy that's bringing stuff in. So she's going to come in to wow him with what she's got, and it doesn't even compare. She's going to ask him hard questions. She's going to spar, mentally with this upstart Hebrew politician who thinks he's a king, and he answers everything. I don't know what kind of questions they were. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall and see what those things were? But he answered it. He dealt with it. In addition to all of those things, she also sees Solomon going up to the house of Jehovah to worship, and it took her breath away. And her response is amazing. I mean, in her testimony, she says, look, what I heard, I didn't believe it. But not only did what I hear was true, but I hadn't even been told half of it. She mentions the prosperity and the wisdom. There's just something here. She mentions the people are happy. When I think of a country like North Korea or something that's run by a tyrant, where trying to flex and do all of this, and you see the propaganda videos and everybody's happy, but then you actually go there and people are living in squalor and stuff like that. That wasn't the case here. She didn't want a report. She wanted to go see it. And when she saw it, she's like, not only, because when you hear about someone that strong, you expect Kim Jong-un or someone like that to be running things, but it's not. The people are in a place of peace. And we know why, because God is their king, and they are at peace with God. They are at peace with each other. They have a king who is ruling by justice and wisdom. And so she, in turn, and that's why, I've got verse 9 like underlined in orange, because her review is to praise God. And she even uses the name of Jehovah. Blessed be Lord, all caps, Jehovah your God, is what she's saying. The people of the world, Jehovah is not a common name for God. A lot of the words in the Hebrew language for God are common. The word God is a common name, a common word that you could say almost like our word for God. We could say, I worship God, and a Muslim says, I worship God. We use the same word. We're not talking about the same God, but it's the same word. But Jehovah is God's personal name, and that's coming out of the mouth of a foreign queen who probably never even heard about this God with this name. She's realizing, you have a God who has favored you and blessed your people and done all this. She is basically saying exactly what God has done. It's been very evident. She's seen all of this stuff, and it has turned her attention towards Jehovah God, and she in turn praises what God is doing. Now, we don't have a lot more here as far as did she get saved and become a Jew. We don't know. In fact, that's not even really what the text is pointing to. There's probably a lot of traditions and legends you could look at. But she picks up on the theological significance of what is happening in Israel. And she even talks about that, that God loves Israel forever. He's made you a king. There's even a little bit of a reference here to this Davidic covenant, that God is doing something amazing now and forever. And so she picks up on that. It's an amazing, as far as reviews go, it's an amazing thing. And it's exactly what all of this is supposed to do. So when we consider this text, the spectacle of wealth and the response that comes from the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of Sheba is a beautiful illustration of how God intends to use, in this case, wealth, but we could broaden that a little bit to be whatever, success or whatever, the spectacle. This is how God intends to use it. The intent of God is to use it as a waypoint, as an attraction, a thing that people come to do. They maybe come to see it. She came for the spectacle, but her attention was directed to Jehovah. It's exactly what was supposed to happen. We don't know much about the conversations that she had with Solomon, but just from what we can see, she didn't just see the spectacle. She also saw Solomon go worship, and her takeaway is that Jehovah has done amazing things for this nation and with this king. And that's exactly what God intended, I think, when he told, all the way back to Abraham, where he said, I will bless those who bless you. In you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. I think that's exactly what God had in mind, is things like this happening, where God blesses them to the point that people come and see, and they don't just come and see, wow, that's a lot of lions in your throne room. No, they came and said, God has blessed you. And so that was what she was supposed to. She would come and give glory to God. Whether she intended on it being a religious journey, I don't think she did. I think she came saying, I'm going to show him some spices he's never seen before. And she's like, oh, these are on sale at the market. What in the world? And not only that, but wow, God has done amazing things. I think her whole agenda stopped. She was going to trick him with her questions, and she realizes he's got the wisdom of God. What is this? God has done great things. Jesus actually refers to the Queen of Sheba in the book of Matthew, and the context here is important. Jesus has been clearly showing the nation of Israel who he is, and we covered this in Matthew a long time ago. And so when Jesus is showing that he is the king, that's Matthew's emphasis, is that Jesus is the king. So it's kind of the right context here. Not the king on a throne, but the king of heaven who's come to bring the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus is proving that, not with wealth, not with that kind of spectacle, but a different kind of spectacle of healing, teaching with authority, all the things that Jesus came to do. And the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew chapter 12, they come to see Jesus. And when they come to see, they don't worship. Instead, they start in on him. They start asking him questions. It's like they came specifically to stump him, to try to trip him up. And so they start asking him, hey, you going to give us a sign so that we will believe? And they start saying these things in verse 38 of Matthew chapter 12. They come and they say, we want a sign from you. And Jesus says, this is an evil and adulterous generation. You're just looking for more signs. And he says, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to show you. He said, I'll show you one sign, just like the prophet Jonah was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. That same thing's going to happen. They didn't get that, and when it was fulfilled, they still didn't get it. But he told them, he points to Jonah, and then he said, the men of Nineveh, verse 41, will rise up in judgment against this generation because they heard the preaching of Jonah and believed. He says, on your judgment day, it'll be as if the Ninevites who heard the truth are going to stand up and say, hey, we heard the truth and repented. You guys had Jesus. You had the Son of God. And you came and saw, and you didn't believe. These people are going to testify against you. And then he mentions the Queen of Sheba. He says the Queen of the South, it's probably the Queen of Sheba, will rise up in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it. For she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. She came all the way to hear Solomon, and just like the Pharisees came all this way to hear Jesus, and one greater than Solomon, and she at least worshiped God. The Pharisees did not. A spectacle, something to come and see, is supposed to direct you to God. And if it's doing its job, it will direct you to God. And he called them out and said, that's the point of the spectacle, is to direct people's attention to God and to worship him. She came and saw and worshiped God. Here the scribes and Pharisees have come, seen one greater than Solomon, and did not believe. And so the point of this is not just to entertain the masses, but to direct to something even greater. So where do we come into play? As we follow Jesus, we have a single purpose. Our job as Christians is to give glory to God. That's why we're here, is to bring the world to Christ. And sometimes God allows us to get into a situation where we may become a type of spectacle. And as I looked through this, and that word was in my mind, which is probably why I came to 1 Corinthians 4. But Paul says this. He's writing to the Corinthian church, and he says, I think that God has made us apostles to be spectacles. We've been appointed to death, a spectacle unto the world and to angels and to men. The word spectacle in the New Testament, the Greek language, is the word theatron, where we get the word theater. And he's like, it's almost like God has taken some of us in our gospel ministry and put us up on stage for other people to look at. And that's not always a good thing. In Paul's case, he got a lot of ridicule. Jesus received a lot of haters. Paul got a lot of haters. And he said for many Christians in his generation, when they came and told, people would come and see, but it wasn't always positive. His opportunity as a spectacle was not near as comfy as Solomon's. We'd all prefer to be Solomon type of spectacle. But he said that's what we're called to do. And it involved martyrdom in many ways. He says we become basically fools for Christ's sake. And his point is that God is free to use us as vessels so the world can come and see and thereby bring people to him because of his work in us. That's what God has called us to do. God may place us in a place where people see us, but our job is to deflect that attention to God in a good way. And I wrote out several things. You could probably come up with more. But I remember as a kid just traveling to different places. Here's a parade of 6 children, somewhat behaved by the grace of God, I don't know. And maybe we're praying over a meal in a restaurant. And it's a little thing, but sometimes God can use that to get attention, not in the wrong way, but by the grace of God in the right way, and direct attention back to him. Someone might be blessed with a certain amount of wealth, and the community knows it. And when that wealth becomes a means of generosity, and somehow, by the grace of God, doesn't turn that person into kind of a self-centered caricature of the elite. It's just a person who's kind and compassionate and generous, and we have some folks like that in Wellington. God can use that to direct attention to him. Sometimes our spectacle is more like what we talked about this morning, where it involves suffering. And maybe we have to go through, God has chosen us to go through something. That is the biggest yawn, Clive. Okay. Is it that bad? You're being a spectacle with your yawning. I'm just kidding. You're good. Sometimes God may put us in a place where we go through some difficult things, but something that could potentially attract attention can actually deflect it for God's glory. I think of people like Johnny Erickson Tata, who is a spectacle in her own right, not able to do anything below her neck, right? And yet doesn't just disappear and bemoan, like we talked this morning, moan about her situation, but actually uses that as a way to glorify God. Fanny Crosby wrote like 9,000 hymns. Could have just disappeared, but became a spectacle, became an attraction, but not for her own gain, but she directed that back to God. A church could have a spectacular vacation Bible school thing, stuff that takes place, and families come, and when used appropriately, it redirects attention. We were talking about this with the last VBS that we did. Most obviously, the purpose of that is to share the gospel with children. We know that. But almost as important, I think, and I had this conversation with several, I was blessed this last month to see the members of our church working together to serve the children in our community. That working together is not usual to see because a lot of humans, they get in conflict. And so to see people working together, having side conversations with each other, setting up, tearing down, dealing with the little terrorists, the little blessings, right, that come in and things, we're doing those things with love. And they know we are Christians by the love we have for each other. That's unique. You see in a culture that continues to get more and more hateful and things. And I'm thankful in general, Wellington is not like that. In general, we are blessed to be in a very, and the reason is because we have a lot of Christians in our community that live like Christians, so that's good. But the world's not used to that. The world in general is not used to seeing Christians together. That's sort of a spectacle, and that's a good thing. And it's not just to say, wow, those people are just nice. Don't let it stop there. It's not that we're just nice, because we're not. We're humans too. But it's the love of God, that we are serving God, and that ought to be what we do, and that ought to be the point. A wealth or blessings ought to be a kind of waypoint. Now, we would be remiss if we failed to consider the flip side, and I think that's why this passage is in the Bible. So consider the testimony here of Dean Stanley. Arthur Stanley was the dean of Westminster back in the 1800s. And in a lecture of ancient studies, he told his students, he's talking about Solomon, and he said that this stately and melancholy figure, in some respects the greatest and saddest in the Bible, he says in detail is little more than a mighty shadow. And he calls Solomon, he calls Solomon, he says he is most purely secular. When you look at Solomon, you don't really see the religious side in hindsight. Instead, it says his merely secular magnificence was an excrescence. An excrescence, that's the word I was trying to think of the other day. That's a gross word. You know what an excrescence is? We should use it more. It's like a boil. It's like if someone has like an infection and it boils and like green pus comes out of it and weird hairs grow. I really enjoy telling Nora this, right? It's nasty, it's gross, right? It's an excrescence, especially if it's like on the end of your nose, right? That's what it is. He says Solomon's growth of his kingdom, it was not a native growth of the chosen people. What should have been is what we see here, that the world came and saw. But by the end of Solomon's life, this was not how it ended. In fact, what it turned into, instead of being a testimony to God, it turned into a wart, the wart of wealth. You say, that's so sick. You'll remember it, though, so there you go. Okay? For Solomon, he enjoyed, we know he enjoyed the glories of God's blessings. He enjoyed that life. But as we know, and we're going to get into next week, it becomes a growing wart on the face of his legacy. This massive kingdom, yes, did direct people to God at one point, but by the end of his life, it becomes his downfall. It takes over. And instead of directing attention to God, taking that attention and directing it to God, he began to absorb it, and it all went into his wart. It's so gross. But it all went into this excrescence that became the power of Solomon instead of the glory of God. His spectacle has become a different kind of spectacle. And let's be careful, and this is sort of the cautionary part of this, let's be careful that our advances in discipleship or our spiritual growth does not turn into something weird and self-serving, because it can. Those kinds of things can happen. Sometimes people may reject us and not want to be around us. That is not a guarantee that we're doing something right. Some people think, hey, that person slammed the door in my face. Well, it may be because they hate Jesus. It may be because you're being a jerk, right? It could be. And so let's make sure that if they hate us, it's not because we have somehow gone into a self-righteous place. It's very possible to do. I think it's easier than we think sometimes. Sometimes it's good to listen to the reviews that other people give with a teachable spirit. Be very careful. Now, earlier this afternoon, I went and checked every possible review I could find on Yelp and Google and Facebook, and they're all good, so don't worry about it, okay? Now watch. Someone will watch this and be like, that hateful pastor. I don't know. Okay, but what if, because sometimes, and I think that's just because we're just in such a small area, that's what it is, but sometimes you see things where people say hateful things. Let's not just assume that they're just mad and wrong. Sometimes it could be that we've come across a certain way. I hope that when someone knows about a people that call themselves Christians, they experience the love of God there. They say, I went there, these people know Jesus. These people know that. Did I meet God because of those people? Is the love of Christ there? I hope so. I hope that we would never turn into a spectacle church. And, as I thought about it, there's probably several ways that could happen. I thought of two extremes. It could be where we just do all sorts of whiz-bang events for whiz-bang's sake, right? We got to do this and this and this and crank it up and make it happen, and we could get a lot more people if we did this and this and this, and that's probably true. But if you do that, you're never going to end. You're just going to you're going to have to keep chasing that, and you're going to have to keep trying to get that, and you're never going to get rid of that wart. It's hard to do. That's terrible. But if you try that, that's not going to work. Sometimes, and we also have to be careful on the other extreme, sometimes hatefulness and divisiveness can happen, and sometimes, just to put it bluntly, sometimes our legalism, our fundamentalism can become a wart. It can. If you're saying, hey, this is who we are, and I don't care what anybody else thinks, well, we should be careful about what others think. We should make sure that we are coming across Christ-like. The Pharisees are the example about that. They were very proud of their warts, and they came to Jesus, and Jesus rebuked them. And he told them, the Queen of Sheba will rise in judgment when I judge you, and she will accuse you, because people came to see Christ, and they came to see Solomon, and they were deflected to God. That should be our job as well. So the answer to our question, why would God let Solomon get so wealthy? Well, in God's economy, spectacular wealth should lead to God's glory. Whatever that wealth is, whether that's a person that has served God for many years and has lived a holy and righteous life by the grace of God, not for self-righteous reasons, but by the grace of God, and is able to now point people to Christ. That's what it should do. That spectacle ought to do that. But it would be a good point of self-examination to ask ourselves this question. Are you done? Are you there? It's on there. Okay. Is your spectacle a waypoint or a wart? And I know that's gross, and I'm sorry, but it'll make you think about it. What is your spectacle? Are we directing people to God, to Christ? Or is it something that we are absorbing in self-righteousness, the things that we're doing, and missing the whole point? The same exact thing could lead to two different places if we're not careful. It's how we steward it. We need to steward it well. Solomon, as far as you can look at, I'm in Matthew, as far as you can look at 1 Kings 10, Solomon is doing things well. We could criticize a few things, and chapter 11 definitely will. We'll get into that, God willing, next week. But he could use those things, and he did, to direct attention to God, but over time it can easily turn into something different. Let's just be careful in our own personal lives as a church, as Christians, as families, that we are remembering what our mission is. And it's not just to be different or to enjoy the blessings. It's to get people's attention back to God and to give Him the glory. And as we're faithful in that, then the Lord will continue to allow us to do those things. And I think that's where even this morning's message in Romans 8, dealing with suffering and different things, the Holy Spirit is leading us through those. So as the spectacle happens, as we get frustrated, let's let God work things together and steward it well so that God gets the glory to it, whatever He calls us to. All right, well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll hear from a missionary, and we'll take some time to pray together. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this instruction. And Lord, as we look at our country, as we look at our church, as we look at our own lives and our families, it's easy to see different ways that we can apply this. But Lord, I pray that as we consider our lives for You, I pray that we sing about sometimes, just channels only to direct others to you. And we just get to be the conduit. We just get to be the pipe that you use to bring others to you. And what a amazing and awesome privilege that is. And I just think of the possibilities of our church, that as we walk with you and you grow in us the fruits of the Spirit of love and joy and peace and so forth, that we're able to not just do those things to be right or to be happy, but to walk with you, and then others see it, and others are able to come to a saving knowledge of you and grow as well. And so we grow together and with you. And what an amazing opportunity we have in this point in time as Christians in the church age, where we get to actually participate in that. So Lord, help us to do that well. Help us to humbly hear the criticism, perhaps, of those that maybe have been wounded and offended. It's so easy for churches to accidentally and unwittingly offend people. But Lord, help us to hear that and to come alongside and to redirect that attention back to you where it should be, and use us carefully to gently be good witnesses for you with whatever talents, whatever situations that you may place us in. Help us to use those opportunities for good, to learn from Solomon's highs at this point, and then to avoid the possibilities of being distracted by those blessings. And so, Lord, help us as we apply this to our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. At this point, we'll stop that stream there.